The morning of September 19th, 1944, broke cold and gray over the rolling farmland of Lorraine, France. In a muddy drainage ditch outside the village of Arracourt, Staff Sergeant Charles Eastman was engaging in a private calculus that would have terrified a mathematician, let alone an infantryman. 400 meters away, through the shifting mist, sat the apex predator of the European theater, a Mark 6 Tiger tank, 56 tons of hardened German steel, an 88mm KWK-36 gun capable of vaporizing a man or machine from 2 kilometers away. It was a weapon designed to dominate the battlefield, a machine that had earned a reputation bordering on the supernatural among Allied troops. In his hands, Eastman held the American answer to this steel monster, the M2 Bazooka, a hollow steel tube, a battery-powered ignition system, and a 3-pound rocket that wobbled when it flew. The technical manuals were explicitly clear. Against the frontal armor of a Tiger, this weapon was effectively a paperweight. The Tiger's front plate was 4 inches thick. The bazooka, under laboratory conditions, might penetrate 3. In the mud of France, against sloped, hardened steel, the rocket would simply bounce off, alerting the German crew to your location just before they turned you into pink mist. Every instinct, every day of training, and every standing order screamed at Eastman to stay low, call for artillery, and pray the tank moved on. But Eastman didn't stay low. He stood up, and he did something that caused his loader, Private First Class Eddie Kowalski, to look at him with sheer, unadulterated horror. Eastman didn't aim at the tank. He tilted the tube back. He aimed at the empty gray sky above the Tiger. He was about to attempt a shot that didn't exist in any manual, a shot that physics suggested was impossible, and that a doctrine called suicide. But what happened in the next 3 seconds wouldn't just destroy a tank. It would rewrite the rule book of infantry anti-armor tactics and expose a fatal flaw in German engineering that no designer in Berlin had ever seen coming. To understand why a farm boy from Pennsylvania was aiming at the clouds to kill a tank on the ground, we have to strip away the mythology of World War II combat and look at the brutal, mechanical reality of 1944. By September, the Allied breakout from Normandy had slowed to a bloody crawl. The Germans, retreating toward their border, had consolidated, and leading their defense were the Panzer Brigades, heavy armor units that had been held in reserve, specifically designed to crush the lighter American Sherman tank. The disparity in equipment was a known crisis. American industrial power relied on quantity. German philosophy relied on quality. The Tiger tank was the embodiment of that quality. It wasn't built, it was crafted. It featured complex, overlapping road wheels for a smooth ride, a watertight hull for deep wading, and an optic system that allowed its gunners to snipe targets at ranges where American tanks couldn't even see them. But the Tiger had a problem. It was heavy. At 56 tons, it strained its Maybach engine and crushed bridges. To keep the weight from becoming completely immobile, German engineers had to make compromises. They thickened the frontal armor because that's where the enemy was supposed to be. They thickened the sides to prevent flanking. But armor is heavy. To buy those inches on the front, they had to steal them from somewhere else. They stole them from the top. The engine deck, the flat metal expanse behind the turret that covered the massive V-12 engine, was covered by steel plate that was barely an inch thick. In 1942, when the Tiger was designed, this made perfect sense. Anti-tank guns fired horizontally. Infantry fired horizontally. The only things attacking from above were airplanes. And if an airplane hit you with a 500-pound bomb, an extra inch of armor wouldn't save you anyway. It was a rational engineering decision based on the rules of war as they existed. But Charles Eastman wasn't an engineer. He was a kid who grew up on a farm outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He hadn't studied ballistics at a military academy. He had studied them in a cornfield. As a child, his job was to keep crows out of the crop. He didn't have a shotgun. He had rocks. He spent years, thousands of hours, throwing rocks at distant birds. He learned, not through equations but through muscle memory, that if you want to hit a target far away, you don't throw straight at it. You throw up. You feel the arc. You let gravity do the work. Fast forward to August 1944. Eastman is in Normandy, examining the wreckage of a destroyed Sherman tank. His squad is waiting for engineers to clear the road. One of his men tosses a rock at the Sherman. It hits the thick frontal armor with a dull, solid thud. Then the soldier tosses a rock high in the air. It comes down almost vertically and hits the engine deck. Clang. It was a hollow, tinny sound. It sounded like a car door, not a tank. That hollow sound triggered something in Eastman's brain. He realized that the mighty tanks, these invincible fortresses, were wearing armored breastplates but paper hats. He realized that if he could get a rocket to drop vertically, just like a stone thrown at a crow, he wouldn't need to penetrate 4 inches of frontal steel. He would only need to punch through 1 inch of deck plating. But realizing a weakness and exploiting it are two different things. The bazooka was a direct fire weapon. It had iron sights fixed for flat trajectories. To use it like a mortar, to lob a rocket over a 60-degree arc and land it on a target the size of a dinner table from 50 meters away, required a level of estimation that borders on clairvoyance. Eastman spent 3 weeks practicing. He used string and stakes to calculate the angles. He fired dummy rounds. He exhausted his platoon leader, Lieutenant Thomas Archer, with his theories. Archer, a pragmatic officer, told him what any officer would. "It's a nice theory, Sergeant, but to make that shot, you have to be within 50 meters of a tiger. That's not a tactic. That's a death sentence." Archer wasn't wrong. 50 meters is dangerously close. It's inside the turn radius of a turret. It's close enough to smell the exhaust. It is indistinguishable from suicide. But on September 19th, Eastman didn't have a choice. The German counterattack at Arracourt had caught the Americans exposed. The fog was lifting. The Tigers were advancing, and Eastman was in a ditch 80 meters from the lead tank with a weapon that couldn't penetrate its front. He watched the Tiger roll past. The massive turret was traversing back and forth, hunting for Sherman tanks a mile away. The German commander was standing in the cupola, binoculars glued to his eyes, scanning the horizon. He wasn't looking at the ditch. He wasn't looking at the infantry. In his mind, infantry were insects, annoying, but incapable of hurting his machine unless they swarmed it. Eastman tapped Kowalski. "Load." He stood up. The mist swirled around his waist. He raised the tube. He didn't look through the sights. They were useless at this angle. He looked at the sky. He felt the weight of the tube, the distance to the target, the memory of 10,000 rocks thrown at 10,000 crows. He squeezed the trigger. The rocket left the tube with a distinct whoosh, riding a pillar of flame. It didn't streak toward the tank. It climbed. It rose 30, 40 feet into the air, its motor burning out in a split second. For a heartbeat, it seemed to hang suspended against the gray clouds, a piece of metal defying the war below. Then gravity took over. The rocket stalled, nosed over, and began to fall. It dropped straight down. The impact was not on the thick frontal glacis. It was not on the turret. The rocket struck the engine deck, directly over the Maybach Phoebe-12. The M6A3 warhead on a bazooka rocket is a shaped charge. It works on the Monroe effect. When it detonates, an inverted copper cone collapses inward, focusing the blast energy into a hyper-efficient jet of molten metal moving at 25,000 feet per second. Against 4 inches of steel, this jet would struggle. Against the 1-inch plate of the engine deck, it didn't even pause. The jet sliced through the armor like a blowtorch through cellophane. It screamed into the engine compartment, where it met fuel lines, hydraulic fluid, and 120 gallons of high-octane gasoline. The result was instantaneous and catastrophic. The Tiger didn't just catch fire, it erupted. The explosion blew the heavy engine access panels off their hinges. A column of flame shot 20 feet into the air. Inside the tank, the fire suppression system was overwhelmed in milliseconds. The crew, sealed inside a steel box that was rapidly becoming a furnace, had seconds to live. The driver's hatch flew open. A man scrambled out, his uniform smoking, rolling into the mud. Then the commander, then the gunner. The invincible machine lurched to a halt, burning furiously, transformed from a predator into a pyre in the span of a single breath. In the ditch, Kowalski was staring at the burning hulk, his mouth open. "Holy Mother of God," he whispered. "Sarge, you actually killed it." Eastman didn't celebrate. He reloaded, because behind the first Tiger, 2 more were emerging from the mist. This is where the story usually devolves into mythology. You will see YouTube videos and read articles with titles like "The Sergeant Who Killed 9 Tigers." They paint a picture picture of a Rambo-like figure sprinting across the battlefield, gunning down an entire panzer company single-handedly. The reality of what happened next is far more tense, far more tactical, and ultimately far more impressive than the exaggeration. The second Tiger commander saw the lead tank explode. His reaction was disciplined and doctrinal. He assumed he had been hit by a heavy anti-tank gun or a tank destroyer hidden in the tree line. He couldn't conceive that a man in a ditch had lobbed a rocket onto his roof. So the second Tiger did exactly what it was trained to do. It reversed. The driver slammed the tank into gear and began backing toward the safety of the woods, keeping his thick frontal armor pointed toward the supposed threat on the horizon. This maneuver, designed to protect the tank, actually sealed its fate. By backing up, the Tiger moved slower than it would have moving forward. It remained relatively stationary in Eastman's field of fire. Eastman and his team scrambled 20 meters down the creek bed, changing their angle. The second Tiger was now closer, perhaps 50 meters away. Eastman adjusted his mental calculation. A little less elevation, a little less lead. He fired again. The second rocket traced the same improbable arc, up into the mist, a pause, and a vertical drop. It struck the second Tiger on the left side of the engine deck near the air intakes. The same physics applied. The same thin armor gave way. The same fuel ignited. Within 90 seconds of the first shot, a second 56-ton behemoth was blazing in the field, its ammunition cooking off in a series of terrifying secondary explosions. By now, the German assault had stalled. The third Tiger commander was in a panic. He couldn't see the enemy. He saw two of his platoon mates burning, but there was no muzzle flash from the tree line, no sound of a high-velocity cannon, just a whoosh from the ditch. He ordered his driver to pivot, to turn the tank to face the creek bed. But a Tiger tank pivoting in mud is slow. It requires the tracks to churn deep into the earth. As the tank turned, it presented a broad, stationary target. Eastman loaded his third rocket. He was calm now. The fear had been replaced by the rhythmic, cold efficiency of a man working a problem. Elevation, windage, drop, fire. The third rocket hit the turret ring, slightly forward of the engine deck. It didn't cause an immediate explosion, but the jet penetrated the crew compartment, severing hydraulic lines and filling the fighting compartment with acrid, choking smoke. The crew, blinded and terrified, bailed out of the still-moving vehicle. 3 rockets, 3 Tigers, 3 minutes. Eastman and his team had 5 rockets left, but the element of surprise, the soldier's most precious commodity, was gone. The German infantry supporting the Tigers had pinpointed the smoke trail. Machine gun fire began to chew up the lip of the creek bed. Mortar rounds started walking toward their position. Lieutenant Archer's voice crackled over the radio, tight with adrenaline. "Eastman, pull back. You've done enough. Get the hell out of there." They withdrew, crawling through the mud, dragging their empty tube. Behind them, 3 pillars of black smoke marked the graveyard of the 113th Panzer Brigade's lead element. Now we have to address the number. 9 Tigers. If you search for this story, you will find sources claiming Eastman destroyed 9 tanks that day. This number is almost certainly false. It is the product of the fog of war, of citations being written weeks later, of battalion reports conflating the actions of an entire company into the heroism of a single man. But here is the reveal that matters. The fact that it was only 3 Tigers makes the story more significant, not less. If Eastman had killed 9 Tigers, it would suggest a fluke, a video game scenario, where the enemy simply stopped fighting back. But killing 3? That suggests a repeatable tactical exploitation of a fatal engineering flaw. It suggests that for 3 minutes the physics of war shifted in favor of the infantrymen. The exaggeration of 9 obscures the genuine tactical brilliance of what Eastman did. He didn't just get lucky. He applied plunging fire, a concept usually reserved for heavy artillery battleships, to a shoulder-fired weapon. He turned a direct-fire rocket into a mortar shell, and the Germans knew it. In the weeks following Arracourt, German after-action reports began to note a disturbing trend. Crews were reporting top attacks from infantry. The German High Command, initially skeptical, examined the wreckage. They found the small, pencil-sized entry holes in the engine decks. The reaction was immediate and desperate. Field modifications began to appear. German crews started welding spare track links to their engine decks. They bolted on sheets of scrap metal. They added spaced armor, wire mesh designed to detonate shaped charges before they hit the main plate. Think about that. The mighty Wehrmacht, the masters of armored warfare, were scavenging scrap metal to weld onto their elite tanks because a farm boy from Pennsylvania figured out how to throw a rocket like a rock. But the legacy of Charles Eastman goes beyond the Battle of Arracourt. When the war ended, the U.S. Army conducted massive studies on tank vulnerability. They interviewed thousands of soldiers. They analyzed the effectiveness of the bazooka, and they realized that Eastman was right. The front of a tank will always be its strongest point. The top will always be its weakest. But relying on a soldier to mentally calculate a 60-degree firing arc in the middle of combat is not a sustainable strategy. Eastman could do it because he was a prodigy of trajectory. Private Smith from Brooklyn probably couldn't. So the engineers went to work. They asked, how do we mechanize Eastman's trick? How do we build a weapon that flies flat but hits from the top? It took decades. It took the development of microchips, guidance sensors, and sophisticated flight software. But if you look at the modern battlefield today, look at Ukraine, look at the weapons that are terrifying tank crews in the 21st century, look at the Javelin, look at the NLW. These weapons do not fly straight. When you fire a Javelin, it launches, climbs rapidly into the sky, reaching an apex of 150 meters, and then dives vertically onto the target. It strikes the thin top armor of the turret and engine deck. It is, in every mechanical sense, a robotized version of Charles Eastman. The guidance computer inside a $200,000 Javelin missile is doing the exact same math that Eastman did in his head in a muddy ditch in 1944. It is calculating the arc. It is using gravity. It is bypassing the strength of the enemy to strike at their weakness. Eastman survived the war. He went back to Pennsylvania, took over the family farm, and lived a quiet life. He rarely spoke about the war. When reporters tracked him down in the 1970s to ask about the Nine Tiger legend, he brushed it off. He corrected them. It wasn't nine, he said, and it wasn't a trick. It was just the only way to stay alive. He died in 1993, passing away just before the Javelin missile entered service with the U.S. Army. He never saw the full legacy of his innovation. But every tank commander today, sitting inside a $1 million fortress of composite armor and reactive tiles, still glances nervously at the sky. They aren't afraid of the gun in front of them. They're afraid of the plunging fire from above. They're afraid of the ghost of Charles Eastman. This story isn't just about bravery. Bravery is common in war. This is a story about adaptability. It's about the terrifying ingenuity of desperate men. The German engineers built a machine that was perfect for the war they expected to fight. They calculated the angles of incoming fire based on the weapons of 1940. They assumed the enemy would follow the rules. They assumed that a rocket launcher was a gun, and guns shoot straight. Eastman looked at the same problem and realized that if the rules say you can't win, you have to change the rules. He realized that a rocket launcher isn't a gun. It's a delivery system. And if you have the courage to aim away from the enemy, to aim at the empty sky, you can turn their greatest strength into a liability. The Tigers at Arracourt didn't die because they were poorly built. They died because they were built for a world that Charles Eastman had just rendered obsolete. The lesson of Arracourt is one that military planners grapple with to this day. You can build the thickest armor. You can mount the biggest gun. You can drill your crews until they operate with machine-like precision, but you cannot engineer a defense against human creativity. There will always be a sergeant in a ditch, cold and scared, looking at your invincible machine and thinking, what happens if I throw this rock up? And in that moment of improvisation, the balance of power shifts. The millions of marks spent on research and development, the thousands of hours of manufacturing, the pride of the Panzer Corps, all of it is undone by a 3-pound rocket falling from the clouds. History remembers the generals. It remembers Patton and Rommel. It remembers the grand sweeping arrows on the map. But battles are decided by the Eastmans. They are decided by the specific, granular details of physics and psychology that occur in the split seconds between life and death. So the next time you see footage of a modern tank exploding from a top-attack missile, don't just think about the technology. Don't just think about the heat-seeking sensors or the shaped charges. Think about a farm boy in 1944. Think about the crows in the cornfield. And remember that the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield isn't the one with the most armor. It's the one with the best idea.